Well, let the pomp and circumstance begin, which is another way of saying that President Trump began his state visit to the United Kingdom today. One commentator I was reading was speculating on the chances that King Charles would be able to sway Trump over the issue of climate change while they were riding side by side in their horse-drawn carriage. And 175 researchers urged the Prime Minister to use the occasion to stand up to Trump on the issue. No. I mean, if I was the king, I wouldn't even go there, because the aim is to flatter Trump and make him feel positive about the United Kingdom so that such feelings can be leveraged over some achievable goals in the future. And likewise for Starmer, who would end up looking very foolish if, having invited Trump to this very special, very unprecedented occasion, he then used it to piss the president off. It would be performative, it would achieve nothing, it would just add to the cascade of negative headlines for the PM at the moment, to the benefit, by the way, of climate skeptic Reform UK. Because obviously Trump is not open-minded about climate. It's not that nobody's ever raised the topic with him, that if only they could come up with the killer argument, then he would be persuaded and become a supporter. Rather, his administration is aggressively and ideologically seeking to destroy any idea of climate action, not just in the United States, but increasingly worldwide. Telling countries negotiating for trade deals that they should buy American oil and they should drop ideas of an energy transition. Telling the International Energy Authority to stop going on about the possibility of such a transition and instead go all in on fossil fuels. More likely, if a subject came up, it would be because it was Trump telling the king that the UK should dismantle all these wind farms and so on. After all, President Trump had all references to climate change removed from government websites. He's had a State of the Environment report produced by a small band of usual suspect skeptics to say that it's all blown out of proportion. So, that's the problem solved. You're welcome. By the way, would that make him eligible for a Nobel Peace Prize, do you think? Incidentally, the International Energy Agency shows no signs yet of caving to Trump's demands. Just yesterday, they produced a report that reinforced its findings 4 years ago, that if the world aims to meet keeping warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, no new investment in oil and gas would be needed. As it is, with a number of major oil fields declining, the industry has been having to run fast just to keep production at current levels. If the energy transition continues, it says, that means less new investment comes into the oil sector, volumes and demand could fall dramatically. But is there any chance of that still happening? David Wallace-Wells wrote a piece for the New York Times that was published yesterday saying that it's not just America. The whole world, he says, has soured on climate politics. From the slightly giddy promise of the Paris Agreement, he said, to the grim reality of today, all the hopes that we were into a bold new era have now been tempered, and there is now much talk about pragmatism and realism. After all, he says, climate champion Mark Carney was elected Prime Minister of Canada, and his very first act in office was striking down the country's carbon tax. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, he pointed out, was a former climate scientist, and yet has invoked the principle of energy sovereignty and boasted of booming oil and gas production in her country. And many European countries and the EU generally have been beating varying degrees of retreat against their formerly most ambitious plans. Now, pointing out that there was quite a lot of unrealistic hubris that followed the Paris Agreement doesn't add a lot to the discussion, because yes, clearly there was. It was contained in the view that politics on the topic had now completely transformed everything, and everybody agreed, bar a few isolated interest groups, that action could accelerate without any friction. But politics always has friction, and it's always cyclical. And of course, numerous things did go wrong. Policies got too little scrutiny because everybody agreed, and some of those policies were poorly judged. They needed the challenge to improve them. The consequences, or threat of consequences, fueled real concern amongst populations of people who were struggling to get by. Scientists and mainstream politicians declared the debate was over, and hence they would not lower themselves to engage with skeptics because it gave those skeptics more importance than they rated. And that was a vacuum that the skeptics happily filled. And over time, they started to win arguments by default. And some of the climate protests, particularly in the UK with Extinction Rebellion, decided to follow a counterproductive campaign strategy of disrupting the ability of ordinary people to go about their daily lives and to attack high-profile events, sporting events or art exhibits and the like. It alienated a significant segment of the public, according to the polls, which, however it was rationalised at the time as being a good idea, appears in retrospect not to have been such a stroke of genius. If you'd wanted to make a broadly consensus issue more polarised, more controversial, you couldn't have come up with a better suited approach. And so, as right-wing populists began their rise, it became one of the areas that they saw as natural for them to attack, a low-hanging fruit issue for them. And as the issue then became party politicised as a result, rather than that point of consensus it had been, then opinion in the wider country as well began to shift. Hence why politicians discovered pragmatism. You can either move at a pace that doesn't hit people hard in the pocket, or you can have a populist backlash that probably means you won't get to do anything at all. Indeed, you get a Trump who, like a swarm of locusts devouring this year's crop, will gleefully dismantle much of the work you've done to date. And yet the laws of physics, of course, don't care about any of this. So we've seen in southern Europe, for example, one of the hottest summers in recorded history, following a couple of other extremely hot summers in previous 2 years. It was a period that saw over 24,000 people die, those deaths attributed to the heat, around 16,500 of which were calculated to be the added human-caused climate change impact. But Trump's energy secretary visited Brussels this week, told everyone that global warming is overhyped and to calm down. So that's all right then. Of course, the climate skeptics will tell you, and on this much they're right, that currently more people die from the effects of cold than they do from the heat. This, however, is an effect that will reverse itself in due course. On a warming planet, the decline in the numbers dying from cold will eventually zero out, at which point no more progress is possible on the plus side, whereas the number and intensity of heat incidents will continue to increase so long as we keep adding to the problem, so that number will relentlessly keep going up. Still, in spite of the Trumps of the world and the various lurking far-right populists across Europe, it still seems like momentum for change is continuing. It's just not based on pieces of paper signed at international conferences. As David Wallace Wells points out, China is rapidly establishing itself as the world's first electrostate, as it positions itself as a green energy superpower. In the last year, China installed more solar power in its own country than the United States has ever done across its entire history. And many of the countries of the global south are buying that technology as they see value for themselves in removing as much dependence as possible from the world's petrostates. It's going to be slower than the Paris Agreement hoped for sure, and that will have consequences, for sure. The COP30 climate conference this year, to be held in Brazil in November, will theoretically be an important milestone. 10 years since Paris. All the countries are supposed to be submitting their new plans for the next stage. A big point. But right now, tiny numbers have actually submitted their drafts. Some of those represent backsliding, not new progression. So expect lots of angst and gloom and upset in November. But remember, while that's happening, companies are still innovating, energy production is coming online, problems are still being solved. Luckily, We don't need to rely on the King of England using his time at the banquet table to persuade the unpersuadable.